Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor. I'm a Sony Imaging Ambassador, and in this video tutorial I'd like to walk you through the setup of the Alpha 1 camera. Now, a lot of photographers will be drawn to this camera for a variety of reasons, and I suspect a lot of photographers who are looking at the Alpha 1 will be shooting high quality movies, high quality stills and fast action. And so we need to be able to set up this camera in such a way that we can move between shooting 8K movies to shooting studio quality stills to shooting fast action with the minimum of fuss. So a little bit of time spent now will save you time in the long run. Now, a lot of photographers will be drawn to this camera for some very important reasons, and a couple of those are just staring at you now, which is 50 megapixels at 30 frames per second, and this will open up a lot of creative opportunities for many photographers. And here is one of them: the ability to shoot fast action at 50 megapixels and then be able to crop really aggressively in to get that dynamic composition that we may want. And we're not sacrificing any image sharpness by doing this, so long as we match the right G Master glass with this camera. And as you can see from the dynamic range of this shot, we've got full detail running from the very dark black hair right through to the bright highlights on the white top that this guy is wearing. No loss of detail. So again, we've got no sacrifice of performance by increasing that megapixel count. And the focus tracking of this camera is a match for the Alpha 9, Alpha 9 II cameras, except we have that increased resolution to crop in really aggressively. And as you can see from the focus tracking here, the focus is exactly where it needs to be, which is on the bird's head, specifically the bird's eye, and I'll be coming to that in a short while. Now, the ability when we're shooting with our maximum zoom lens, our telephoto lens, maybe 600 millimeters, we still often need to get closer still, and having that 50 megapixel count certainly gives us that creative freedom to crop in post-production to create the subject that fills the frame. And as you can see here from this illustration, it shows you how much we can actually crop in and still get an image that will go on a 4K screen. Now, the pixel count on the height of a 4K screen is 2160 pixels, and as you can see from this very aggressive crop of this racing greyhound, I've still got enough pixels to go full height on that 4K screen. And as we can see from these portrait shots of these racing greyhounds, we have rich detail even in these aggressive crops. One of the other options that this high megapixel sensor gives many photographers is the ability to shoot in APS-C mode and still have 21 megapixels. This gives us the option to either shoot full frame or APS-C mode, so basically every lens becomes a dual focal length lens, if you like. It also gives us the opportunity to shoot with APS-C lenses, as was the case with this image, where I'm using the E70-350, a very small lens, but has a full frame equivalent reach of 525 millimeters. And even when we're shooting at the lower 21 megapixel count, we can still crop in aggressively into this frame to get a 4K image. If we are shooting in APS-C mode and we're using say a full frame lens such as the 200-600 zoom at 600 millimeters, if we need to get even more reach, we can add the 1.4 or 2 times teleconverter. Here I'm getting a reach of 1260 millimeters to capture this speeding action in the bay off the beach. Now, resolution, okay, we're not even limited to the 50 megapixels. If you're shooting still subjects such as this image here, and we need an even higher megapixel count, there is a feature called Pixel Shift Multi-Shoot, which allows us to capture 16 images in quick succession each time the sensor moves by just a couple of pixels, and combined we get a resolution of 199 megapixels. Now, one might say, well, who on earth would need a 199 megapixel resolution from a camera? And so this is an illustration. This is the pixel dimensions of 199 megapixels, 17,280 pixels by 11,520 pixels. If we divide that by the optimum file resolution in PPI for printing purposes, 240 PPI, we end up with a print size of 6 by 4 feet. Now, if you are into printing very large prints with optimum detail, so much detail so the viewer can actually walk right up to the print and start counting the whiskers, this is a sort of resolution that will actually give you a great advantage apart from just shooting at the 50 megapixel resolution. And here I am standing in front of prints captured at 60 megapixels with the Alpha 7R4. Now, they work very good if you just step a couple of steps back from the print, but the extra resolution from the pixel shift multi-shoot feature does allow you to walk right up and put your nose on the print and literally count the whiskers on the meerkat or the guy's beard that we're looking at here. Now again, if by raising that megapixel count, some Alpha 9 or Alpha 9.2 users are thinking, I don't really need to slow the camera down from what I'm currently experiencing, so I don't want those extra megapixels if it slows my workflow down. And the good news is this camera is really built for speed, and an Alpha 9, Alpha 9.2 user will not be slowing their workflow down. In fact, you'll be actually speeding it up if you match this camera with one of the new CFA Express cards. This is going to clear the buffer exceptionally quickly. In just a few seconds you can fill the buffer with 238 raw files, and that will clear in a matter of seconds. And if you wanted to change any of your camera settings while the buffer is clearing, you will not be prevented from doing so. And if your 80 gigabyte card is full and you need to pass it off to an assistant to get those files onto your laptop computer, that card will basically transfer those files in just over 1 minute, or just over 2 minutes for the 160 gigabyte CFA Express cards. Now, the high ISO performance is going to be astonishing, especially if you're used to shooting maybe with an Alpha 7R4, which is good at high ISO but not nearly as good as the Alpha 9 cameras and the Alpha 7R3 cameras. So this is where we can really push the ISO up beyond 6400 and still get no noticeable noise. Now, this is a JPEG file format with the high ISO noise reduction set to standard. And I haven't done any additional work on this file, so if you're looking into the areas of smooth bokeh and you're saying where is the noise, that's exactly what I'm asking myself. And also you can see on the AF tracking of this running dog, the focus is not on the tip of the nose, it's further back along the nose there towards the eyes, which is exactly where it needs to be. So again, we've got that seamless focus tracking of an Alpha 9 camera with the high resolution of the Alpha 7R cameras and the high ISO performance of the best full frame cameras on the market today. And there is another example of what these files actually look like in camera JPEGs at 8000 ISO with the high ISO noise reduction set to standard. And what I've done now is I've actually switched the noise reduction off in camera just so you can see how much noise is actually there. I've also cropped into 24 megapixels, which is a 6K crop. As we crop in more aggressively, obviously we're zooming in on that noise, so we can see that even with a crop we're still not aware of that noise even at that higher ISO values, in this case 1250 ISO. And here is the high ISO noise reduction switched off in camera at ISO 3200. You might just start to become aware of some of the noise now in some of those darker shadow areas. But remember, no noise reduction in camera, no noise reduction in post. So this image is going to clean up beautifully for a high quality image. Now 30 frames per second is one of the other things that will draw photographers to this camera. Now 30 frames per second is a variable figure. You might find that your frames per second slows down a little depending on the lens you're using and depending on some of the camera settings you've got set up. If you absolutely need those 30 frames per second, just match a native Sony lens. Look for the lenses with the XD linear focus motors. Those will keep up with the Alpha 1 camera. You also need to set the priority set in AFC to release, not focus or balanced emphasis. And if you don't need the tracking, which most photographers don't need to track a subject if you're just focusing on a single moving subject, just set the focus area to wide rather than tracking wide. The images will still all be sharp. You really only need the tracking options if your subject is going to disappear behind obstacles momentarily. That will slow the tracking or the frames per second down slightly, and you might find that you're shooting at 25 frames per second instead of 30 frames per second. But that 30 frames per second is a very reliable figure so long as you match the camera settings and lens to the Alpha 1 camera. When do you need to use those 30 frames per second? Well, anybody who's shot sports where there's a ball involved, maybe tennis or football or soccer, you're obviously going to really enjoy the 30 frames per second because you'll never have like 2 frames where the ball is either not in the frame or has already left the frame. And obviously you can pick the decisive moment. But it's also suitable for very explosive actions like with this eagle just about to capture something in mid-air with its claws. You want to be shooting at the maximum frames per second so the hero moment is not going to escape you. And so here is my hero moment for this particular action. The claws outstretched, just about to seize its food, and so I have that with the perfect moment from that 30 frames per second. And here is another example. Here I'm shooting just 30 frames per second, shooting at a triathlon with people emerging from the swimming segment. Now they emerge from the water really quickly and grasp that first breath while standing up. And certainly you want to be able to choose the absolute best moment with the water spraying off the body and with the arms just at the right position. You can then just comfortably discard all of the frames that don't meet your framing criteria. And again, here is another decisive moment with a kite border, and again this one actually highlights the AF tracking capability. As I was tracking this kite surfer here, the action went behind somebody walking across the beach in front of the camera momentarily, but as you can see from that middle frame on the left side there, you can see that the only thing visible left of the action is the wires to the kite, but the camera is not giving up. Now you do want to set the camera to the locked on option in order to achieve this level of stickiness with your subject. You don't want to go to the responsive where the camera decides the subject has gone for long enough, now it needs to pull to a nearer subject. So I actually prefer that locked on option when you're tracking a subject most of the time. And here again is showing you the absolute astonishing tracking capability of the Alpha 1. Now I'm shooting these zoomed in on that 100-400 G Master lens. Obviously the IAF is really helping out here, and the action is going to pass the camera very quickly because I'm zoomed in, and this is a full frame capture. I haven't cropped into this one, so swinging the camera really rapidly and letting the IAF take care of where the focus needs to be. Now again, I would choose the wide focus area in this instance because I don't want to be trying to put a moving spot on a moving target. I want to be able to just use the wide focus area and let the camera do all of the work for me. And again, you know, one of the things that you will probably want to do as you change your subjects from humans to animals to birds is just monitor which subject detection you're currently using. So I've actually put that in a function menu, which I'll be coming to very shortly. So I can just change the subject detection from humans to animals or animals to birds within just a second with the camera at my eye. So I don't need to lower the camera and dive into the menus. All of this is capable with the camera at your eye if you've set up the camera correctly, and we'll be moving on to that in just a minute. So there's the human eye, it completely ignoring the fist as it comes towards the camera and just holding on to the eye at all times. And of course the bird photographers are now super impressed that they can track the eye of a bird in flight. Now this does require a little bit of contrast for the eye. So if you've got a brown eye nestled in amongst brown feathers, you might just want to switch bird IAF off if you notice the eye tracking isn't 100% accurate. But in most instances where you've got quite a distinctive eye, then just let the bird IF take over, as it has tracked this seagull in full flight beautifully in this particular action sequence. Now, one of the things that has changed from older alpha models is the eye of your subject no longer needs to be inside of your selected focus area. Now, I've selected the zone focus area, and as you can see with this this bird here walking towards me through the long grass, the eye is outside of the focus area, but the priority will always look for an eye wherever it is in the frame. Now this is a slightly changed IF behavior from some of the latest A7 cameras, so you just want to make sure that you're aware of this change functionality, and this is the same with animals and also humans now. Now, one of the things that you will see when you're looking at images in the viewer, the Sony Imaging Edge viewer app here, is you can actually see where your focus area was targeted in post-production as you're reviewing the image. Now, this is a very useful feature to learn about where the camera is focusing. But I will hasten to add that sometimes the focus area on very rapidly moving subjects might not match up to exactly where the focus area was. Now this might be improved with time, but don't freak out if your focus area is slightly off, because the final proof of the pudding here is by zooming in and actually checking what is actually sharp in the frame. For instance, here's an example with the bird on the left where it says the focus area is on the tail, but quite clearly when I zoom in, the focus area is exactly where it needed to be, which is on the eye of that bird in flight, not on the tail. So don't get too freaked out if you notice the focus area is in the wrong place. I think that is just with the 30 frames per second shooting rapidly moving subjects, sometimes the focus area doesn't quite keep up, or the indication of the focus area. The actual focus is usually spot on, but where the focus frame is actually positioned in the frame might not correlate exactly to where the camera was focusing. Okay, let's move on to that camera setup. This is where we're going to spend a little bit of time setting the camera up, so we're not going to have to deep dive into the menus every time we switch from birds in flight to portraiture to landscapes. We can basically just move just a couple of buttons on the camera and then completely reconfigure the camera for a completely different subject. Now these are my preferred settings, and if you don't have your preferred settings down pat yet, then just match mine, but you may want to modify and change some of the settings from what I'm going to be recommending now. Now as you're setting up the camera, you will notice that we do have that touchscreen not just for focus but also for menu selection. Now this might be useful if your fingers aren't too fat and you're quite adept at touching and navigating menus. Actually, once the camera was set up, I actually disabled this for myself. I can actually select all of the menu items I'm looking for with the camera at my eye, so I don't need to be using the monitor for menu selection after the camera has set up. Now the menus have gone through a little bit of reconfiguration. This first appeared on the Alpha 7S3 camera, and a lot of reviewers were very happy with how Sony remanaged where the menu items are positioned in the menus. So you might, if you're coming from an older Alpha camera with the older menu structure, you might be hunting around for a few of your favorite menu options. So in the next slide or two, I'm just going to help you out with where some of those menu items might have moved to. Now the playback and network menu tabs are relatively unchanged, so nothing has moved out or into those menus from the other menu tabs. But we do now have the shooting menu, the exposure, color, a menu tab just devoted to focus, which is great actually. So you will find that with the old menu structure, touch operation, switching it on or off, and function of touch operation, touch tracking or touch focus, were separated out by many pages. Now they're right alongside each other. So if we are looking at setting up the camera for touch operation, we're only in the one tab. We're not having to move between two different tabs. So they're color coded. Some of the menu items you might be looking for may be outlined here. I haven't listed them all here, but for a basic setup, these will be the ones that cover you to set the camera up. You might just want to pause the movie or do a screen grab so you can quickly check that you're comfortable with where your menu items may have moved to. We're looking at the shooting, exposure, color, and focus menus primarily is where you're going to be spending the time setting this camera up. Now if you've skipped a model upgrade and you're just setting the camera up, there are a number of menu items that you may not be familiar with. You may have missed them coming into a recent model Alpha. These are not new necessarily to the Alpha 1, but they're menu items that you may have missed in recent models. Pixel shift multi-shooting was available with previous R model cameras, so this is also available on the Alpha 1. This is where you can get extra quality for static subjects right up to the 199 megapixel count there. We have silent mode and target function settings. Now if you're used to Alpha 9 cameras using a fully electronic shutter, you might say, well, why do I need a silent mode when the electronic shutter doesn't make a noise? But the silent mode here will basically disable all noises the camera is capable of generating, even the pixel mapping noise as you switch a camera off. So if you're on a film set or you're standing next to a pro golfer, you don't want the camera to make any noise at all, not just the simulated shutter release sound. So this is the silent mode, and the target function settings are important menu items to spend a little time just setting up so the camera is configured for exactly what you need it to do. We've got anti-flicker shooting, which some of the Alpha 7R users may be familiar with the Alpha 7R4, where we don't get any banding from fluorescent lights. But we also have a variable shutter setting that we saw on the Alpha 9 too. So we don't get any LED signage at professional sports games, basically strobing or banding. We can fine-tune the shutter speed in incremental steps to remove any likelihood of strobing of those LED lights, the high frequency banding there. We have the live view display. Typically a lot of photographers using mirrorless are used to switching it on or off, but we now have some additional options there, including something called flash effect. Those need checking out as well. We have the ability to add a voice memo. So if I'm in the street and I take a picture of somebody, but I'm about to do 200 portraits, I can quickly add the name of the person that I've just captured. I don't need to put that in a notepad and then try and work out which name goes with which picture. I can just add that directly to the file itself when reviewing the image. We've got different settings for still and movies. So if you're used to quickly switching between capturing stills with a high shutter speed to shooting movies with a slower shutter speed, you're not going to have to keep on changing that shutter speed setting. And you can also roll that over to numerous settings, as we're going to look at. So we're not having to worry about whether the ISO is set to auto or whether it's fixed. The camera will change its settings depending on whether you're shooting stills or movies. We have the anti-dust function that we saw on the Alpha 9 II. This is the ability to close the shutter mechanism so the sensor is not exposed to dust when switching off the camera and then changing lenses, as is illustrated on the right hand side of this frame here. Let's just go back. We've got aperture and shot result previews, which are very useful if you've switched the setting effect off in live view display. If you quickly want to see what depth of field you're getting at your chosen aperture, these are very good settings to assign to custom keys, and you can also activate this using the Bluetooth remote as well. We have bright monitoring, which is basically night vision for your camera, very useful for astrophotographers when the level of ambient light is exceptionally low. And we've got a flexible exposure mode now for when we're shooting movies, which is a great feature from just going, it's an alternative to going fully auto or fully manual or even semi-auto. We can now basically freeze or unlock the various exposure features such as aperture, shutter release or ISO. So you might want to trial that new workflow out if you're shooting movies. As we customize the camera, for most photographers you should be able to avoid going into the menus other than to format the card, to be honest. If you set up the FN menu, the function menu, we have separate function menus for stills and movies. We have custom key settings, and because we have a drive mode and focus mode physical hard dial on the top left, that will free up an additional 2 custom keys on your camera, so much so that you might run out of things that you actually want to assign to a custom key. And then we have the My Menus, that if you do periodically have to go and hunt for an item in a menu, really if you've done it more than once or twice, you really just want to put that menu item in your My Menu so you don't have to go hunting for that menu item ever again. Now the movie settings, as I said, this is something that you definitely want to go into pretty much now, is just go down to that setup menu, that yellow toolbox icon there, go into the page 3, different set for still movie, and typically a couple of the key items there is shutter speed, ISO. You typically want to have very different settings for shooting movies to shooting stills, so you can just still select those 2, or you can add some additional ones that you want to prioritize as a difference when you're setting up the camera. As I said, those function menus is going to be great for just changing frequently used menu settings, and obviously we can change those menu settings either with the touch monitor feature there, just by touching the icon, or, which is what I prefer to do, with the camera at my eye, just press the FN key and then change the function menu item that you're wanting to modify. So spend some time there. You'll see that I've extensively modified the function menu for both stills and movies to suit my own workflows here. And this is another freeze the video moment here, is if you want to just check out what I've actually assigned to all of those function menus there for both stills and movies. Now, as I said, you might have your own preferences here, but if you haven't thought about this clearly yet, use this as a starting point and then modify your preferences as you move forward in time. As I said, I changed a function menu item with the camera at my eye, with the finder at my eye. And the way I would just do this is, one, press the function button. I'll just reach down with my thumb with the camera at my eye, just press that function button. I will navigate using the multi-selector to the function menu item, and then I will change the item using the front or rear dial, and all of this can be activated in just a second or two. So as I change from human IF to animal IF to bird IF, I can do that in just a couple of seconds with the camera at my eye. Now, custom keys, as I said, we've got a lot of choices for those custom keys, and so I've mapped all of my custom keys out there. I've highlighted two important ones there, which is the recall custom hold 1 and recall custom hold 2 there. If you're unfamiliar with using these features on a, say, an Alpha 7 camera, these do come into their own on Alpha 9 and the Alpha 1 camera, and I'll go into some detail about why those are such important custom key functions on an Alpha 1 camera. And again, you can assign completely different functions to those custom keys when shooting movies. And we're not done there. We can actually assign different settings in playback mode to those custom keys. Now, two really important ones for me in the playback mode is the select playback media. Obviously we have two card slots, and the ability to switch and look at what's on card 1 or card 2 is very important. This is also very important because we can't assign this currently to the function menu. So if we've assigned it to a custom key in playback mode, we're never having to wonder, am I reviewing the images on memory card 1 or memory card 2? And the other one, of course, is that voice memo. Now I've set that to hold, so I just need to hold down the custom key 2 as I'm reviewing an image, just to add some information about that particular image as I'm reviewing it. Now, the MyMenu settings. Now, I've added quite a few here, but what I've managed to do is there's 55 pages of menus on the Alpha 1. Now, I've extensively added my preferred menu items to just 4 pages. So I've condensed 55 pages down to 4 pages, and I've spent some time thinking about organizing what appears on what page. I've not just added them as I've thought of a new item to add. So and you can do this, you can reorganize your MyMenu as well as adding new items. So I've decided on page 1, and you can have more than 4 pages, I hasten to add, but on page 1 I've added the general menu options. On page 2 I've added my studio options, sort of things that I might need to go into when I'm shooting studio, such as pixel shift, multi-shoot, etc. I've gone in and added menu items specifically for shooting movies to page 3, and again menu items that I often use when shooting action stills to page 4. And if you can think of a 5th and 6th page, then obviously the Alpha 1 will allow you to add even more items. So if anybody complains about the Sony menus, just say it's exactly the way I've set it up. There, I do not have to basically work with what a software engineer chose for the menus. I've set up the configuration for the menus exactly as I need them to be. And to be honest, I don't go into menu items very often because I've got access to them via the FN menu and the custom keys themselves. Now, another important part of the camera setup here is on the shoot mode dial you have 1, 2 and 3, as well as the movie and the S and Q, or slow and quick. I typically will be using these 5 shoot mode icons. I typically don't use the P, A, S, M and auto. Now I will start pretty much 95% of what I shoot just using 1, 2 or 3 for stills. So it's very important that I set these up. Now, just a word of warning for anybody who's coming up from another Alpha camera that's not an A9. Obviously, with the focus and drive modes on that physical dial on the top left side of the camera, we cannot assign those to the recall memory functions. So we do need to keep an eye on what's on the top left hand side of the camera. So as I'm setting the camera up for sports or portrait or landscape, I won't be able to set up whether the drive mode is set to 30 frames a second or single shooting mode. I will have to physically move that on the top dial there. So okay, so there is a way of working around that, and so again that comes back to the recall custom hold feature, which I find very valuable on the Alpha 9 cameras and also the Alpha 1. Now the way I've set up 1, 2 and 3 is I've assigned an acronym called PAL, Portrait, Action, Landscape 1, 2 and 3. So just remembering that acronym, I can always remember if I'm shooting handheld landscapes, I just need to go to L, which is assigned to number 3 on the shoot mode dial, and that basically will do most of the work for me. I just glance up to the drive mode on the top left hand corner of the camera and just move that from 30 frames per second down to single shooting mode, and I'm now free to start shooting landscapes as I would like to shoot them. Now I do have a movie that outlines this workflow because it's a big game changer for a lot of photographers when they realize that deep diving into menus is not a prerequisite for using all of the features of a very sophisticated camera. So I would check that movie out in more detail if you are thinking of adopting a simplified workflow. Now don't consider the 1, 2, 3 as straitjacket groups of settings here, because you can override specific items as you move into 1, 2 or 3. It just means that if you switch the camera off and you turn the dial from 1, 2 or 3 back to number 1, it goes back to those default group settings that you've memorized. So my portrait settings that I've registered the memory to on number 1 will prioritize shallow depth of field. Now I have said that they're portrait settings, but I will often use them for other subjects which are not specifically portraits, like I do shoot flowers with my portrait settings, where I do value shallow depth of field. I'll also need to freeze slow movement. That could be a portrait figure that's moving their head slowly, or whether it's a flower moving slowly in the breeze. I do want to be able to freeze that slow movement with an appropriate choice of shutter speed, and I'll obviously with portraits want to be using that human eye AF. Now I've listed there, and again you may want to just pause this movie while you look at the settings I've chosen to memorize. Just remember that okay, I will be having to just double check the drive mode and focus mode for the settings. So for instance, for portraits I prioritize the continuous drive mode, but in low. I don't want to be shooting portraits at 20 or 30 frames per second, and I'm leaving the focus mode in AFC. I do want to be able to shoot a slow moving subject or be walking with the camera as I'm shooting portraits, such as a parade or a demonstration. So continuous autofocus is still the drive mode that I prefer when or the focus mode I prefer when shooting portrait. Typically I am favoring shallow depth of field, so I'll have my default setting set at f2.8 or wider. Now often when I am shooting single portraits I'll actually shoot wide open, but as you can see, as soon as I include another person, I'm not going to risk the depth of field being too shallow for that second or third person. So I'll quickly override my default setting if I've got it set to f2.8 to close down to f4 or 5, 6 or even f8 if the group size starts increasing. So, but I know that shooting a single subject wide open, even with an 85 or 135 prime, I am going to get the eyebrows, the eyelashes and the retina of the eyes all sharp. we will see a fall off of the focus towards the ears and maybe even the tip of the nose, but we will be rendering that background, and I'll just go back up one slide there. We will be rendering that background bokeh beautifully silky smooth, so we get that beautiful figure ground separation, so there are no distracting elements in the background. And as you can see here again, the 135 lens as well as the 85 G Master lens are my favorite portrait lenses for very shallow depth of field. Now I will have a minimum shutter speed set to approximately 1/250th of a second, but as the ambient light grows, that shutter speed is more likely to be closer to 1/1000th of a second than 1/250th as I'm shooting with wide aperture prime lenses. But obviously as we go down into darker environments here, maybe this was photographed under a bridge here, we'll see that I am still managing to keep my ISO low and my shutter speed still fast enough to freeze slow movement of maybe a head that's just turning or a hand that's slowly moving up towards the cheek there. And again, obviously I'm shooting with 1.8 wide open aperture in this instance, but the leading eye will always be prioritized if the camera has to choose. You can actually choose whether you choose left eye or right eye. The camera by default will choose the eye that's closest to the camera, which is what I prefer in 99% of instances. It will only choose the trailing eye if the leading eye is slightly obscured in some instances, such as a lock of hair falls in front of that eye. So again, you might want to assign left eye, right eye to a function menu if portraiture is your primary genre, but for me, I'm more than happy the camera making the choice because it gets it right 99.9% of the time. If I am shooting wildlife with my portrait settings, obviously the wildlife mustn't be running, otherwise I'd be choosing my action settings. But if I'm shooting these birds that are standing in the lake, then I'm going to use those portrait settings. Again, my minimum shutter speed of 1/250th of a second, which I might raise to 1/500th of a second if these birds are moving around consistently, but I am going to get appropriate settings, and the bird IF will take over as long as I've remembered just to modify my default settings from human to bird IF. You'll see a little bit of subject blur on the flapping wings top right there because I'm not using my action settings for this particular instance. Occasionally you will find that human IF or bird IF or animal IF won't kick in because of the nature of the eye in the particular scene that you're photographing, such as in this instance where my subject is wearing a cap, so the eyes are in slight shade. There's significant makeup and jewelry around the face, so the IAF might go, I'm not even too sure whether this is a face that I should be looking for an eye in. In those instances I have touch tracking enabled. Now you can do that from the monitor, but I typically have touch tracking enabled with my touchpad settings, so I just slide my slide my thumb onto the monitor and just move the focus point to specifically the target area that I need the camera to focus on. This is also very useful if you've got your focus area set to zone or wide. You can quickly ignore any foreground subject matter such as the board this guy is holding or standing behind. I can always push back to my primary subject even though I don't have spot AF point selected by default. And obviously in a sports context, having that ability to set your primary focus area to zone or wide, but override that just by sliding your thumb across the monitor and selecting a specific player, or in this case a specific cyclist, will ensure tracking is enabled, and then the camera will never jump to the foreground subject matter. So this is a very useful and quick override. Again, it's something that I can avoid having to change focus areas if I can just do that with touch tracking enabled. Moving over to my action settings, so I can just slide if I'm shooting a static portrait and now I'm shooting somebody running. I'll just move my shoot mode dial from 1 to number 2. Now what my action settings are prioritizing is freezing rapidly moving subject matter, and I aim to track that subject matter, so even if it goes behind obstacles I will continue to track that primary subject matter. And obviously continuous shooting. Now I will be setting that on the top dial on the left side of the camera, either to high or high plus. Occasionally, if the subject matter is moving quite slowly and there's no surprises in what is happening, you might slow that down to medium or low. And on the Alpha 1 camera you do have a choice of setting the frame rate for medium and low, so you can have low working at 5 frames per second, or you can modify that faster if required. Again, this might be a freeze the video moment while you just take a look at that. I should hasten to add I will be releasing a downloadable ebook for this camera, and these tables will be laid out in that ebook, which will be my support to the Alpha community. Again, we can see the beautiful AF tracking of these action settings, which have frozen this third Dan black belt martial arts woman seemingly floating in space. Although she's not floating, she's moving exceptionally rapidly, but the camera shutter speed set to 1/2000th of a second is freezing that rapid moving action. And the AF is so reliable, I am very comfortable with shooting this at maximum aperture to get that figure ground separation from the background. One of the new things that you may notice on the Alpha 1, it did appear on the Alpha 7C camera as well, is the ability to change the AF on button to tracking on AF on button. So if you're waiting to shoot a burst, but you want to start tracking your subject prior to pressing the shutter release, you can just press your AF on button if you've modified that to tracking on, and then start tracking your subject. So I find this a very useful modification to the default setting for the AF on button. Now again, this is also very useful if your subject is maybe will work its way to the edge of the frame. So if you can just frame your subject closer to the center, press the tracking on AF on button, it doesn't really matter if it moves right to the edge of the frame, your camera will carry on tracking it even if you've got wide or zone AF area selected. And again, if you're shooting with your action settings, the default for me will be humans, because I shoot a lot of action sports with humans involved. But as soon as I move to fast action involving animals, I'll just make that modification. Again, a reminder, just press the FN button, move to the subject detection, move the front dial to change from humans to animals or animals to birds, and I'm away shooting. One of the great things about shooting fast action on an Alpha 9 or Alpha 1 camera is the zero blackout you get when shooting at the fast frame rates. You're basically not going to be distracted by the blinking of a mechanical shutter, because you'll be using the electronic shutter for shooting fast action with no shutter distortion involved. And of course, we've got that beautiful viewfinder on the Alpha 1 camera. Such high resolution when we're shooting landscapes or static subjects, but we can change the priority to a fast refresh rate, 200 frames per second on the refresh rate of that finder when we're shooting really rapidly moving action. Now you can't have high resolution and fast frame rate, so those are sorts of things that you would write into your memories when changing from, say, shooting portraits on 1 with a very high resolution finder to shooting fast action sports on number 2 on the shoot mode dial. You don't have to remember to change your finder settings because the camera will remember what finder settings you prefer for shooting different genres, and this really brings in the value of that 1, 2, 3 or PAL settings that you've assigned to that shoot mode dial. So they find a frame rate. Again, there's a sort of an in between there. There's a high frame rate with good resolution. Then there's a very fast frame rate, the higher frame rate for when the camera is moving really rapidly. You're chasing auto sports or a really rapidly moving birds in flight. You want to be able to track that really reliably. So prioritizing refresh rate of frames per second in the viewfinder might be better than choosing a really high resolution view that you're looking at. So that 30 frames per second coming into its own again, with really rapid bursts of action, such as this dog catching a frisbee midair. You typically, even at 30 frames per second, you're only going to be choosing between 4 or 5 frames, with the frisbee just about to go into the jaws of the mouth, to the dog giving you a bit of a selfie portrait smile or grin as he's saying, look at me, I just caught it. So, and again, you will have that choice over the decisive moment. You won't be going, say, on a 10 frames per second going, look, ideally the frame would have been in between these two. On a camera that shoots 30 frames per second, you'll have your moment. And so for bursts of action, whether it's raptors catching prey or sports action, you are always going to have your moment. And I can't resist zooming in again on this 4K crop of this bird's eagle, and I find myself looking for my own reflection in the glint or reflection in the bird's eye. Such is how incredibly great the autofocus performance is on the Alpha 1 camera. Now there is a couple of times when I want to override the default, and the quickest way of doing this is if I want to blur the background, choose a much slower shutter speed. Here I would have preferred a shutter speed closer to 1/250th of a second rather than 1/2000th of a second. This does require particularly good panning skills, I have to say, especially using the long telephoto lenses and the subject matter is very close. But if you do want to create that subject blur, rather than going into completely modifying all of the settings, I assign a completely different choice of settings that I can access just by holding down a custom key. And so one of the ways I've done that is to set in a recall custom hold group of settings, and in this instance I just hold down the focus hold button on the lens, which I've reassigned to recall custom hold 1, to go from freezing action to movement blur. So to highlight that, this is a classic case where I'm freezing the action. Somebody emerges from the water in the swimming section of the triathlon, and I'm more than happy with freezing this. But now if I want to somebody stand still to remove their wetsuit, I don't want to be shooting this at 30 frames per second, so I'll hold down my recall custom hold 2. I've overridden the AEL button to recall custom hold 2, and now I can shoot just a single shot at 1/500th of a second instead of a burst of 30 frames of somebody unzipping their wetsuit. So this is a way I can override that. Now I can't override that on the shoot mode dial. Like you might say, well, I could have moved from action 2 to 1, but that wouldn't take care of the drive mode setting on the top left hand camera. So this is really where the recall custom hold features come into their own, and you've got a choice of 3. Typically I only use 2, but you might find a great use for number 3. Again, birds in flight, you're looking to freeze a bird in flight. but the bird is still perched. So again, you don't want to be shooting at 20 or 30 frames per second. You just want to be shooting at a lower shutter speed. And of course, the advantage of doing this is as you lower the shutter speed, because the bird is static, you're also lowering the ISO. So you're going to have a really high quality portrait shot of this kingfisher rather than maybe a high ISO bird in flight shot. So here are the settings, and this is another freeze the video moment, so you can see how I've set up my recall custom hold 1 and recall custom hold 2. Now obviously you have a choice of custom keys to assign this to, but obviously you've got to be able to access that custom key very quickly. So custom key 1, 2, the AEL button and the focus hold button on the lens are going to be your friends for the recall custom hold features here. So one of the other reasons that I might override, say, an action setting in auto exposure, which is typically what I do when shooting action sports, is this instance where I'm tracking a bird in flight, where the dark background might suddenly change to a very bright sky. And I don't want to be having to move that exposure compensation dial quickly. I want maybe just to have the exposure locked, because the bird is staying in the sunlight. It's just the background tone that is changing from something very bright, the sky, to very dark, such as these tree foliage in the background. So this is where I would switch to the manual exposure shooting mode here. And the way I monitor the optimum exposure for these settings is to use the zebras feature. Now I do have a video tutorial called Zebras 109 Plus for raw shooters. Now a lot of people, movie shooters, will use the zebras to monitor a highlight tone and have the figure set much lower, such as 70 to 85, and they're monitoring a highlight tone and keeping it exactly where they need to be. They might have the aperture ring on the lens declick, so they're just keeping the highlight exactly where it needs to be. As a stills shooter shooting raws, I will just be using it as an overexposure warning. So I will set up my zebra so that it is not having any exposure in the brightest highlight detail. You only need to do this once if the ambient lighting conditions are staying the same, such as on a sunlit day. All I need to do is make sure the white plumage isn't overexposing. If the bird is not present, I would just set the exposure or the ISO setting, which will be set to a manual ISO setting in this instance. I will just set it so that the white clouds are not clipping or overexposing. This will ensure my highlight tones are always protected from overexposure. And then when the camera is completely set up for action, you could be shooting a landscape and then suddenly you hear a charging dog over your shoulder. You just make a couple of settings on the moving the shoot mode dial from 3 to 2, moving the drive mode from single to continuous, and away we go. Just 2 changes and we've completely reconfigured the camera for 2 completely different genres, and then you'll be more than happy that we're not missing any decisive moments for shooting fast action. Okay, and so the number 3 on the shoot mode dial is I call my landscape, but you can shoot anything that requires a little bit more depth of field. Typically I do like that figure ground separation with shooting very wide apertures, but in some instances you want to draw the background into sharp focus, and so this is my landscape setting. So, and as I said, depth of field becomes a priority. typically assign this when subjects are static, so I can use much slower shutter speeds than when shooting portraiture or when shooting fast action. Now obviously there are a number of factors that control depth of field. Obviously the primary one would obviously be aperture on your lens, which you might want to stop down to f8 or f11 for this group of settings. Then there's obviously the focal length. As we use longer telephoto lenses, we're going to start seeing shallower depth of field. And of course then there's the distance to your subject. As you get closer to your subject or the foreground element, the depth of field is going to decrease, so we're going to need to stop down maybe from f8 to f11 or even in some instances to f16. Now they are handheld landscapes settings that I'm outlining here, because I can only slow the shutter speed down so far before encountering camera shake. Even with optical stabilization on the lens and steady shot inside, I do need to modify these settings knowing that I can hand hold the camera. The camera doesn't need to be on a tripod in order to get this particular shot. Now obviously with landscapes where you can put the camera on the tripod, you will override a couple of the settings in this group of settings, which I'm registering to number 3 on the shoot mode dial. Now I'm sure you're very familiar with the classic landscape using maybe a wide angle zoom lens, such as shooting landscapes with a 16mm focal length. We have foreground, subject matter, middle distance and distance, and typically most landscape photographers want all 3 of those elements sharp, and that's where the starting point will typically be f11 or f16. But for this typical landscape here, I don't have the distant mountains or horizon line, so I might open up to f8, which might be a sharper aperture on this particular lens here. So again, we can quickly override. That's the only override to number 3 that I've made here, apart from just setting the drive mode on the top left hand side of the camera to single shooting mode. Again, if I'm shooting with landscapes and I don't have immediate foreground, I'm shooting with maybe a longer telephoto lens, again I might want to open that aperture up because everything is way over in the distance, and I might also try and keep the ISO as low as possible by slowing the shutter speed down. Now the default setting will be ISO auto minimum shutter speed slower, which will give me those slower shutter speeds. But if you can brace the camera by putting your elbows on a nearby surface or rock or bench or even the ground, you might want to go even slower. Again, you might go into that ISO auto minimum shutter speed, which I've assigned to my custom key 1, and I will then go in from slower and actually set it to something that I know I can handhold. Now I know I can handhold some quite slow shutter speeds if I'm really bracing the camera using my elbows, and so I have slowed this down to 1/25 of a second, even though it's captured with a long telephoto zoom lens. There are instances where you might think you want to be on the landscape setting you set to 1, 2 or 3, but it's an atypical landscape, and so here I've shot this landscape with my action settings, and because the priority for me is not the depth of field in this instance, it's the shutter speed I need to freeze the crashing wave hitting this rock in the middle of the sea here. So yes, the secondary will be I'll try and get a little bit more depth of field. My action settings actually use aperture priority rather than shutter priority as the default shoot mode when I'm setting these up. So I will actually then go in and just see how much I need to stop the lens down to get the depth of field, watching the ISO climb as I do that. I've decided on this particular 25mm focal length I can get enough depth of field at an f4 aperture, because the foreground subject matter is not that close, it's more like middle distance. Occasionally, when you do have the opportunity, like in very low levels of ambient light and the foreground subject matter is very close, and you do have a tripod available, you want to come out of the auto exposure modes and go into manual exposure modes, and you can then start using ISO 100 instead of ISO auto. So I've done that in this instance because not only do I want a large amount of depth of field, but I also want to extend that shutter speed to smooth the busy water here. So I've pushed the exposure time out to 30 seconds. So I definitely need to be using a tripod in this instance, and I'll actually start the exposure by either using the self timer or by using the Sony's Bluetooth remote there, which I've paired to the Alpha 1. Now I'll often go into manual focus as well, because in manual focus this allows me to set the optimum focus point, which is something called the hyperfocal distance. Now obviously having the viewfinder set for maximum quality, giving you the highest resolution in the viewfinder, really comes into its own now when we use the magnify view. So we zoom in and we can check if I've set my focus distance at say 5 meters. Is the closest subject matter still sharp, and is the subject matter right over there on the horizon line, is that also sharp at f11? If I need a little bit more depth of field, I'll move out to f16 to increase my depth of field, or I might want to fine tune the focus point or just step back from my proximity to the closest subject matter, again in an attempt to extend depth of field. Again, overriding that default, if I've assigned that to 3, is when I'm using those long telephoto lenses, I'll sometimes open the aperture so I can increase the shutter speed and keep the ISO low. Now let's move on to the movie settings. Now obviously a big fanfare for the Alpha 1 camera is, yes, it shoots 8K videos, and it does shoot spectacularly high quality 8K videos. And so if you've got the opportunity to view video footage on an 8K TV, then definitely this is going to be something that you want to do. Now I have to say there aren't a lot of choices when you're setting the camera up for 8K. Your frames per second and your format of the video is pretty much set for you here. So you'll have just basically two choices here for the amount of compression that you're putting onto that movie. Now the 400mm is going to be higher quality than the 200mm setting. So I'm going to presume that if you're shooting in 8K, you're actually wanting the maximum quality that this camera will deliver. So the default starting point for me would be to set it to 400mm, 420, 10-bit quality. This will give you a little bit of flexibility in post-production to fine-tune the grading of this movie in post-production. Obviously, when we are moving over to 4K movie settings, we're going to have much more choice about the format of the video and the frame rate here. Now, if you're new to shooting 4K movies, I would just adopt this as the default setting, and then over time, if you find something suits your needs more precisely, like smaller file sizes or different frame rates, you can then modify from there. But my default format would be, recommendation would be XAVCS 4K. I'm using a 50 frames per second rate because I'm not in the USA. You might have chosen 24 or 30 or 60 frame rates here, and I'll be using the least compression on that, which is the 200mm 422 10-bit movie quality, and this does give you a huge amount of quality when shooting 4K video footage. Now there are a lot of settings to consider, so you definitely want to be either freezing this video. You might also want to consider setting this onto the shoot mode dial. Now, as well as 1, 2, 3 on the shoot mode dial, you can also save another 4 groups of settings to a memory card. Now, just be aware that when you reformat that memory card, you do lose those saved settings, but at least before you go out for a day's movie shooting, if you're not shooting movies all of the time, then you can set that up on the memory card, so you can quickly load the camera up with all of these settings in the safe knowledge you're not going to miss one of the settings and then kick yourself later when you get back home. A lot of news that when this camera launched was whether you could get this camera to overheat, and certainly when I was testing this camera with an 80 gigabyte CF Express Type A card, I could not get the camera to overheat even in very warm summer temperatures here in Australia. Now, one of the ways that you could possibly get the camera to overheat is put the camera in full sun and then start recording for more than 15 minutes. So if that is something that you're likely to do, I would just put some shade over the camera for such a long recording period. Whether you just rig up some sort of gobos or just shade the camera with an umbrella even, this will mean that the camera doesn't overheat for you. A couple more movie settings to consider that you might not have accounted on previous cameras is you do have steady shot, you also have active steady shot. So if you don't have a gimbal to put the camera on but you do intend to walk with the camera, then active steady shot is going to be your friend. Now, active steady shot, you will lose some of the angle of view. So if you're looking for a 50mm angle of view on a full frame sensor, you might shoot active steady shot with your 35mm prime instead of your 50mm prime, because you will lose some of that angle of view. You'll get much smoother footage. You will actually look like the camera is in fact on a gimbal, even though you're just walking steadily with the camera in your hands. But that is a small sacrifice. Another way of doing this steady shot footage is actually to do the steady shot in post-production. You can disable steady shot altogether and then just use the gyro data from the sensor to stabilize the footage in post-production with Sony's free software called Sony Catalyst. So again, that is something to check out if you're unfamiliar with these type of workflows, but steady footage is something that you aspire to capturing. If you're not going to go down the full gimbal route and you are prepared to use active steady shot or Sony Catalyst software for stabilizing your footage, then these Bluetooth accessories are going to become your new best friends. Whether it be the shooting grip there, which is Bluetooth, you don't need to plug in wires, you just need to pair this with the camera. Then you've got the Bluetooth microphone system, and you've also got the Bluetooth remote there. Again, all three very useful Bluetooth devices that use no wires that need to be plugged into the camera. Interesting thing about that Bluetooth remote is we do have a C1 and an AF on button on that, and those are buttons that can be customized on the camera. So you can assign C1 pretty much to anything you want to assign to C1, and then pressing the remote will activate that command. Now, in a studio situation, I've been used to setting the C1 and AF on buttons to aperture preview and shot result preview, but you may come up with your own ideas about what you want to assign to that, and so the camera might not even be in your hands because it's on a rig somewhere, but you can change the settings on the camera just by holding down C1 or AF on button. Another thing to be aware about with the Alpha 1 camera, as with the Alpha 7C and the Alpha 7R4 cameras, we do have the new multi-interface shoe which will accept the digital shotgun microphone. So instead of recording an analog signal and converting it to digital, it records a digital audio signal and passes that digital audio file straight onto your movie file that you're recording in camera. So that might be a microphone that you think is worth checking out, because that will give you great quality shotgun audio feature there. Another couple of things that you really want to set up with the camera up with before you start shooting is the zoom feature. Now, you might be using prime lenses, but that doesn't prohibit you from zooming a prime. We should be able to activate clear image zoom, which you can see on the menu item on the right side there, and we can set that up so we can zoom from the super 35 mode from the full frame mode there, so you can get up to 2 times zoom on a prime lens there. You'll also want to set up the zoom speed. If you're in standby mode and you just need to change the starting point for the zoom, you want that to happen very quickly. So you'll set a fixed speed zoom to quite quick. Here I've got it set to 3, but actually as you're zooming whilst recording, you might want a very much slower progressive zoom, shift the focal length during recording, and so you can set that to slow. And here is a couple of screen grabs from as I'm zooming. Now, I will want to assign a custom key to activate this clear image zoom, and then I'll just press the left side or the right side of the control wheel to zoom in or out as I'm filming. Another feature that you may not be used to working with when shooting movies is that flexible exposure mode that I outlined at towards the beginning of this setup movie. Now, it does allow you to press a custom key and then come out of manual into auto for any one of the 3 exposure controls, whether that be ISO, aperture, or shutter speed, and that might be an improved workflow from just working completely manual. Okay, so that is definitely something to check out and work out whether this offers any improvements for your own workflows when shooting video. Obviously, one of the priorities that most video photographers will want to access is the ability to move from a fixed ISO and modify that because of changing ambient lighting conditions. So in the default setup, you would simply press the C2 key, roll that rear dial to change the ISO value, and then press the C2 key again in order to modify your ISO value. Of course, you can go into the menus and change your frame rate if you're looking to move from shooting 24, 30, 50 frames per second, or whatever you've chosen to do. If you want to move up to those faster frame rates like 100 or 120 frames per second, you could go into deep dive into the menus, or you could just use the S and Q mode on the shoot mode dial. Now, you can set that up for shooting at the higher frame rates, and that avoids the need to go into the menus to modify the frame rates you're doing there. So again, go into the menus, because you will need to set this dial up so you can quickly access it in the future. Go into the S&Q settings, select your record frame rate and the actual frame rate, 100 frames per second. So this will play back at 25 but record at 100, so 4 times slow motion video footage is what I'll be getting in the 4K format there. And so you will want to choose the compression, and obviously shooting at that higher frame rate, I'll choose maximum quality on that as my default setting there. A couple of other settings that you maybe have to set up for the very first time is the flash settings on the Alpha 1 camera might be different to the way you've typically controlled flash settings on previous setups. One of the things that we do have access to in the menus is something called external flash settings, which will talk to a Sony flash. So you don't need to actually set the flash settings on the flash unit itself. You can set them on the monitor or even in the electronic viewfinder without lowering the camera from your eye. So this particular flash that I'm highlighting here is the HVL-F28RM flash, and it doesn't have a panel at all for changing the settings because it's all done via the camera menu system here. So I can go in, and if I'm just doing some fill flash here, I could change the flash exposure compensation down to -1 or -2 EV, depending on how much fill flash I want to add to the subject. So this is something you need to be aware of if you are going to use Sony flash units. Another major change for the flash, as well as being able to use flash with the electronic shutter, is we also have a much faster maximum sync speed with the mechanical shutter when using flash. We've pushed that up to 1/400th of a second, and what that means for many people using these smaller speed lights is I'm much more able to move from using my HVL-F45RM flash as a fill flash to using it as the primary light source. Here I've even pushed it through a lighting modifier off camera, and yet the flash is actually overpowering a sunlit scene behind the subject here, which I'm using a mannequin to demonstrate this. And because I'm using the HVL-F28RM as the commander, I can also use that not only to control the output of the off-camera flash, but also to add a little bit of fill as well from the on-camera position. So an amazing way of controlling all of your flash systems with the camera at your eye using the menus of the Alpha 1 menus. And finally, we're coming to the end of this video tutorial with a setup. But one of the things that you should definitely do after spending an hour or two setting up this camera to completely suit your own workflows is to save all of the settings of this camera off onto a memory card. Now remember, the memory card will lose this saved memory if you reformat the camera. So your first port of call after saving it to the memory card is to move that over to your computer and then save that on a computer disk, so that if you ever want to reconfigure a second Alpha camera, or you've completely initialized this camera and you want to put back in your camera setup, you can do that. And I will get around to sharing my own cam set files with the Alpha community, so that if you wanted to set up your camera exactly the same way as I've set up my camera, you could do this just by loading my cam set file from your memory card into your camera. It's such a great feature, and you can also use it to capture multiple configurations of the same camera. So you could set the camera up completely configured for studio settings or photographer A, and then load a completely different group of settings for location work or photographer B into that camera. Such a useful feature for having to ensure that you don't have to repeat all of this work a second time. So what we're doing is we're basically going to remember all of our menu items that we've set this camera up, and that includes the custom key settings, the register custom shoot settings, those with the recall custom hold settings that we assigned to 2 different custom keys. We've also got all of the FN menu set up there. The only thing that won't be saved to this cam set file is the 1, 2 and 3 shoot mode settings. Now you can transfer those over to a memory card as well, each one at a time, by assigning them to M1, M2, M3 settings on your memory card, and then you could recall those at a future date. So as you can see, this was a camera designed to improve workflows for a broad variety of photographers, whether they're drawn to the resolution of the camera or the ability of this camera to capture fast action or its high movie performance. But the setup of this camera really comes into its own if we can move between those specialist areas really quite simply without spending too much time in the menus, because once we've done the work we should be able to reconfigure the camera with just a couple of key presses, and then the camera moves from shooting 8K movies into shooting fast action, or fast action to landscape, or still life high resolution with pixel shift multi-shoot. So this is how this camera will reward you if you've also spent some time with this setup. So I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Imaging Ambassador. I will support this Alpha community by now moving on to creating an ebook, which you should be able to download by going to my website markgaylor.com and looking for the download section. Hopefully you've enjoyed this movie. Give me the thumbs up, and I'll catch you online next time.